The roar of the Phantom's engines was deafening, the sleek black aircraft cutting through the clouds like a blade. Inside the cockpit, Captain Marcus Hale gripped the controls with white-knuckled precision. His jaw clenched as the turbulence hit, a slight shudder running through the experimental aircraft. The mission was supposed to be simple. Get in, test the new trans-dimensional jump technology, report back. Just another Black Ops mission for the books. He glanced over his shoulder at the rest of the team, all strapped in tight. Lieutenant Sarah Quinn, the sniper, stared out the window, her face a mask of calm that never seemed to crack. Sergeant Isaac "Tank" Ramirez sat next to her, tapping his fingers on his lap, restless as always. The guy was a beast with a heavy weapon, and his bulk nearly filled the entire seat. Corporal Jake Novak was behind them, his eyes fixed on a tablet as he monitored the Phantom systems. "Hey, Cap," Ramirez called out over the intercom, a grin spreading across his scarred face. "You sure this thing's safe? I don't want my ass fried when we jump into whatever hellhole they're sending us." Hale smirked. "Relax, Ramirez. If something goes wrong, I'll let you know so you can kiss your ass goodbye." The rest of the team chuckled, the tension breaking for just a moment, but Hale could feel the weight in the air, the unspoken unease that lingered at the edges of their bravado. This wasn't just another mission. They were flying into uncharted territory, literally. The military contractor had sold them on the idea of crossing dimensions, but no one knew what was on the other side. Quinn leaned forward, her voice calm but steady. "We're hitting the jump point in 5. Hale nodded, focusing on the controls. "Everyone strap in. Novak, how's the system?" "Stable, I think," Novak replied, glancing at the flickering readouts. "This tech is so far above my pay grade, it's not even funny, but we're good to go, for now." Hale's hand hovered over the button that would activate the jump. A deep breath. "Here we go. On my mark. 3, 2... The world exploded in a violent jolt. The sky outside the cockpit twisted, the blue vanishing in a blur of dark, pulsating shadows. The Phantom lurched, alarms blaring as the controls went haywire. Hale fought to keep the craft steady, his heart slamming against his ribs, as gravity itself seemed to warp. "What the hell?" Ramirez shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. Quinn's knuckles whitened as she gripped her seat. "Hold on!" The aircraft shuddered again, and suddenly, the world outside the cockpit shifted. No longer the clear blue sky of Earth, but a nightmare. An endless expanse of darkness stretched before them, a grotesque landscape that looked like it was made of decaying flesh. The ground below was a massive, rotting corpse, with mountains of twisted bones and valleys of decomposing flesh. A foul stench seemed to seep through the Phantom's vents, thick and suffocating. "What the fuck is that?" Novak gasped, his face pale as he stared out the window. Hale didn't have time to respond. The Phantom was spiraling out of control, flames licking at the fuselage as the systems malfunctioned. "Brace for impact!" he yelled. The crash was brutal. The Phantom slammed into the grotesque ground with bone-crushing force, metal screeching as it tore apart. Hale was thrown forward, his body straining against the harness as the aircraft skidded to a halt. The sound of tearing steel and breaking bones filling his ears. For a moment, everything was still. Hale groaned, his head pounding as he unstrapped himself and stumbled out of his seat. The cockpit was a mess, smoke billowing from the control panels, and the acrid scent of burning wiring filled the air. He turned to check on his team. "Quinn, Ramirez, Novak, sound off," he barked, his voice hoarse. "I'm here," Quinn called out, her voice steady, but Hale could see the strain in her eyes. "Still in one piece, Cap," Ramirez grunted, but when Hale looked over, he saw the big man clutching his leg, blood seeping through his pants. His face was pale, but his expression remained defiant. Novak was slumped against the wreckage, his face covered in blood from a gash across his forehead. I'm good," he said, though his shaking hands betrayed him. Hale moved quickly, helping Ramirez to his feet. "We need to move. This thing's not holding together." Outside, the landscape was worse than Hale could have imagined. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the ground beneath their feet felt alive. It pulsed, as if the very earth was breathing, expelling bursts of rancid air. Twisted structures of bone jutted from the ground, towering over them like the remains of some ancient, forgotten civilization. The sky was an endless black void. No stars, no sun, just a deep, consuming darkness. "What the hell is this place?" Novak muttered, his eyes wide as he scanned the horizon. Hale didn't have an answer. They were in another dimension, that much was clear. But this was something far worse than they'd been prepared for. Then, they heard it. A low, bone-rattling screech echoed across the landscape, followed by the sound of flesh tearing. Hale froze, his hand instinctively reaching for his weapon. From the shadows of the bone structures, figures began to emerge. They weren't human. The creatures that crawled toward them were grotesque amalgamations of flesh and bone, their bodies twisted and malformed. Faces, human faces, were fused into their flesh, mouths open in silent screams. Their limbs were long and jagged, ending in sharp, broken bones that clicked against the ground as they moved. "Open fire!" Hale shouted, his weapon roaring to life. Bullets tore through the creatures, but they barely slowed. The monsters kept coming, their bodies absorbing the impact, chunks of flesh and bone falling away only to be replaced by more. One of the creatures lunged at Ramirez, its maw snapping open to reveal rows of serrated teeth. Ramirez fired, but the beast was too fast. It crashed into him, knocking him to the ground. Before anyone could react, it tore into his chest, ripping through his body armor as if it were paper. Ramirez screamed, a sound that would haunt Hale for the rest of his life, as the creature sank its teeth into his flesh, pulling his intestines out with sickening ease. Blood sprayed across the ground as the creature feasted. "No!" Quinn shouted, her voice breaking as she emptied her magazine into the beast. But it was too late. Ramirez was gone. Hale grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "We need to move, now!" The remaining creatures closed in, their grotesque bodies illuminated by the brief muzzle flashes of their weapons. Hale and Quinn ran, Novak trailing behind them as the screeches of the monsters filled the air. The ground pulsed beneath them, the very earth seeming to come alive as they fled. They barely managed to escape the horde, ducking behind a cluster of bone structures that offered some cover. Hale's chest heaved as he tried to catch his breath, his mind racing. "We're not on Earth," he said, the realization settling in. This is something else." Quinn wiped the blood from her face, her hands shaking. "We're trapped, aren't we?" Hale didn't answer. He didn't need to. The stench of rot lingered in the air, thick and suffocating, as Captain Hale, Lieutenant Quinn, and Corporal Novak huddled behind the cluster of jagged bone structures. Blood still dripped from Quinn's hands, though whether it was hers or Ramirez's, she couldn't tell anymore. Hale's breathing was labored, his mind reeling from the brutal loss of their teammate. The nightmarish landscape stretched before them, an unholy fusion of decaying flesh and bone, pulsing as though the ground itself was alive. Every breath they took felt heavy, like they were inhaling the decay. And the screeches, those bone-rattling shrieks, echoed in the distance, reminding them the creatures were still hunting. "We can't stay here," Hale said, his voice a strained whisper. "We move fast and quiet. Novak, anything on the comms yet?" Novak, pale and shaky, was fiddling with the comm device he'd salvaged from the wreckage. His hands trembled as he checked the signal, but the interference was overwhelming, warping the static into twisted, garbled noise. He shook his head. "Nothing. It's like this place is jamming everything." Hale's jaw tightened. Of course it was. Nothing about this mission had gone right since the moment they crossed into this dimension. His thoughts flickered back to Ramirez, torn apart in front of them. He couldn't let his mind linger there, not now. "We head east," he continued, gesturing to a ridge in the distance that seemed to offer some cover. "We don't know how long we have before those things come back. Keep it quiet, and stay alert." Quinn and Novak nodded, though neither seemed convinced they'd make it. With the remaining ammunition divided between them, the three moved, creeping through the grotesque landscape, their boots sinking into the flesh-like ground. Every step was met with a sickening squelch, as though they were walking across something that shouldn't be alive. They pressed forward in silence, the air heavy with an unnatural humidity, a constant reminder that this world wasn't theirs. Hale's eyes scanned the horizon, searching for movement, But in a place like this, everything felt like it was moving, breathing, waiting. It wasn't long before the hallucinations started. At first, it was subtle, just a flicker in the corner of Hale's eye. He glanced back, and for a split second, he thought he saw Ramirez's mangled body trailing behind them, crawling across the ground, his entrails dragging behind him. Hale blinked, shaking his head. Focus, stay focused. But it only grew worse. The darkness seemed to warp the landscape, bending it like a funhouse mirror. Jagged bone structures twisted into grotesque shapes, resembling limbs and faces contorted in agony. The ground beneath them shifted, swelling like it was breathing. "Captain," Quinn's voice broke through his thoughts. She was staring into the distance, her face pale, eyes wide. Hale followed her gaze. In the far-off horizon, rising from the decay, was an enormous structure, what looked like a cathedral of bones. The ribs of some unimaginable beast jutted toward the sky, forming an archway into the black void. The pulsing flesh around it was darker, more decrepit, as if the entire landscape was in a state of rot. "Jesus Christ," Novak muttered, his voice barely audible. "What the hell is that?" Hale didn't have an answer, but he knew they were being drawn toward it. The ground around them was subtly sloping in that direction, as though the entire world was funneling them to that cursed cathedral. "We keep moving," Hale said, though the weight of his own words felt hollow. "Stick together." As they approached, the hallucinations grew stronger. Quinn stopped abruptly, her eyes widening in horror. No, it can't be." Hale grabbed her shoulder. "Quinn, what is it?" She didn't respond, her eyes locked on something only she could see. Her lips quivered as her hand reached out, trembling. "My brother. I see him. He's here." Hale snapped his fingers in front of her face. "It's not real, Quinn. Whatever you're seeing, it's not real." But her face contorted in anguish. "I can hear him, Captain. He's calling for me. I can't just leave him." Before Hale could stop her, she bolted toward the edge of the ridge, running as fast as her legs could carry her. He shouted after her, but his voice barely carried in the thick air. She disappeared into the darkness. "Shit!" Hale turned to Novak, who was already panicking, his breathing erratic. "Stay here. I'll get her." But before he could move, the creatures returned. They crawled from the shadows, grotesque amalgamations of flesh and bone, some of them larger now, their forms more grotesque than before. One creature, its limbs unnaturally long, dragged a mass of decaying flesh behind it like a tail. Its face was a twisted blend of human and beast, mouths screaming in silence across its torso. "Light 'em up!" Hale shouted, opening fire as Novak followed suit. The bullets tore through the air, but the creatures seemed unfazed, their bodies absorbing the impact with sickening ease. One lunged at Novak, its jagged claws slashing through his armor, embedding itself in his chest. The scream that followed was cut short as the creature's mouth, lined with teeth, crushed his skull like a ripe fruit. Blood sprayed across the rotting earth, Novak's body collapsing in a heap. Hale barely had time to process the loss before another creature came for him. He fired again and again, but nothing stopped them. They were endless. He turned and ran, his boots pounding against the ground as he made a break for the bone cathedral. His breath came in ragged gasps, his mind clouded with fear and exhaustion. He had no idea if Quinn was still alive, or if he was running toward her, or something far worse. The bone structure loomed closer, its ribcage arching into the sky like the jaws of a great beast. As he crossed the threshold, Hale felt a sudden pull, as though the very air inside the cathedral was thicker, darker. The ground pulsed beneath him, each step heavier than the last. Inside, the walls were lined with bones, human bones, and the flesh that clung to them seemed to writhe as though it was still alive. The stench of death was overwhelming, filling his lungs with each shallow breath. He heard Quinn before he saw her. Her voice, soft, almost a whisper. "He's here." Hale moved deeper into the cathedral, his gun raised, ready for anything. In the center of the chamber, Quinn stood, staring at something on the ground. As Hale approached, his heart sank. She was looking at nothing, just a patch of rotting earth, but in her mind, she saw her brother, her face streaked with tears. "I can't leave him again," she whispered. Hale reached for her, but before he could pull her away, the ground beneath them exploded. The creature that rose from the earth was unlike anything Hale had ever seen. It was massive, its body a grotesque fusion of bone, flesh, and machinery, its head a twisted mass of skulls and gears grinding against one another. Its arms were long, jagged appendages, dripping with black, oily blood. It let out a deafening screech as it lunged toward them. Hale grabbed Quinn and pulled her back, but she didn't resist. She just stood there, whispering her brother's name. The creature's claws slashed through the air, and Hale barely had time to throw himself between it and Quinn. The impact sent him flying, crashing against the wall of bones. His vision blurred, and as he tried to push himself up, the creature descended upon them. There was no time, no escape. Hale's hand found the last explosive charge in his vest. With a final, defiant scream, he ripped the pin and threw it at the creature. The explosion rocked the cathedral, sending a rain of bone and flesh in every direction. The last thing Hale saw was the creature's massive form collapsing, its body disintegrating in the blast. And then, darkness. The smoke hung thick in the air, a choking blanket of ash and charred flesh that lingered in the cathedral's ruins. Bone fragments and slick patches of blood splattered the decaying walls, the remnants of the explosion still crackling in the distance. Silence followed in its wake, a heavy, unnatural quiet that settled over the rotting earth. From the center of the carnage, something stirred. Slowly, a figure emerged, staggering through the haze. Its form was barely recognizable at first, just a twisted mass of flesh and bone, grotesque in its contorted shape. But as it stumbled forward, dragging itself from the wreckage, the figure began to take shape. It was Captain Marcus Hale, or what was left of him. His body was grotesquely warped, fused with the decaying flesh of the world around him. His once strong limbs were now twisted appendages of bone and sinew, jagged and malformed. His face, once sharp with determination and resolve, was a grotesque mask of agony. Patches of his skin melted into the hideous creatures he had fought. One eye remained human, glistening with the last traces of his former self, while the other was a monstrous amalgamation of bone and rotting tissue. Hale, if it could even be called Hale anymore, staggered forward, his movements jerky and unnatural, as though each step was a battle between what he had become and what he once was. The weight of the transformation bore down on him, but something deep within kept him moving. A flicker of humanity danced in his one remaining eye. For a moment, it seemed as though he might remember, might know who he was. He looked around, scanning the carnage as though searching for a way out, a way to escape the hellish nightmare he had been thrown into. But there was no escape. There never had been.